The desert sun burned overhead as Jake Morrison rode his horse along the dusty trail. His weathered hands gripped the reins while sweat dripped from under his worn cowboy hat. He had been traveling for 3 days straight, moving cattle from one pasture to another on his small ranch in Arizona Territory. The year was 1885, and life was hard for a man trying to make an honest living in the wilderness. Jake was not a big man, standing just under 6 feet tall, but he had strong shoulders and calloused hands from years of hard work. His brown hair was getting gray at the temples, and lines around his blue eyes showed he was no stranger to squinting against the harsh sun. At 35 years old, he had been running his ranch alone for almost 10 years, ever since his wife, Mary, died from fever. As he rode through a narrow canyon, Jake heard voices ahead. He slowed his horse and listened carefully. The voices were speaking in a language he did not understand, but he recognized it as Apache. His heart began to beat faster. Relations between the white settlers and the Apache tribes had been tense for years, with fighting breaking out regularly across the territory. Jake quietly dismounted and tied his horse to a small tree. He crept forward on foot, staying low behind the rocks. When he reached the edge of a clearing, he saw something that made his blood run cold. 3 Apache warriors had surrounded a woman, and they were clearly threatening her. But this was no ordinary woman. She stood nearly as tall as the men around her, perhaps 6 feet in height. Her long black hair hung loose down her back, and she wore traditional Apache clothing, made of soft leather decorated with colorful beads. Her face was beautiful but fierce, with high cheekbones and dark eyes that flashed with anger. She held herself proudly, showing no fear even though the 3 men were clearly menacing her. Jake could not understand their words, but their body language told the story. The warriors were pointing at her and making demands. One of them grabbed her arm roughly, and she pulled away with a sharp word that needed no translation. Jake realized these men were not from her tribe. Their clothing and war paint were different from hers. The woman's name was Ayanna, though Jake did not know this yet. She was indeed Apache, but from a peaceful band that lived in the mountains, far to the north. She had been traveling south to visit relatives when these 3 warriors from a hostile group had found her. They wanted to take her back to their camp, either as a prisoner or as a wife for their chief. Ayanna had no intention of going with them willingly. Jake found himself in a difficult position. He knew that getting involved in Apache business could mean his death, but he also could not stand by and watch a woman being threatened, no matter what tribe she belonged to. His mother had raised him to respect women and protect those who could not protect themselves. He checked his rifle and his pistol, making sure both were loaded and ready. Then he took a deep breath and stepped out. From behind the rocks, "Let her go," he called out in English, raising his rifle. All 4 Apache people turned to look at him in surprise. The 3 warriors immediately reached for their weapons. 2 had rifles and 1 carried a bow with arrows. Ayanna's eyes widened as she saw the white cowboy, but she did not move. "I said let her go," Jake repeated, even though he knew they probably did not understand his words. His tone and the rifle pointed at them made his meaning clear enough. The largest of the 3 warriors, a man with scars on his chest and red paint on his face, said something to his companions. They spread out, trying to surround Jake. This was exactly what Jake had feared would happen. "Look," Jake said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I don't want any trouble. Just let the woman go and ride away. Nobody has to get hurt here." The scarred warrior laughed and said something that sounded like an insult. He raised his rifle toward Jake. In that moment, Jake knew talking was over. He dove to the side just as the warrior fired. The bullet whistled past his ear and struck a rock behind him. Jake rolled behind a large boulder and fired back. His shot was true, and the scarred warrior cried out and stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder. The other 2 warriors, immediately, began shooting at Jake's position, their bullets chipping pieces off the rock that protected him. Ayanna used the confusion to her advantage. While the warriors were focused on Jake, she picked up a heavy stone and struck one of them on the head. He dropped his bow and fell to his knees, dazed. The 3rd warrior turned toward her, but Jake was ready for him. Another shot from Jake's rifle sent the man running for cover. The wounded leader shouted something to his remaining companion, and both men began to retreat. They helped their dazed friend to his feet, and all three of them disappeared into the rocks, leaving their horses behind. Jake kept his rifle ready and waited several minutes to make sure they were really gone. Finally, he stood up slowly and looked at the tall Apache woman. She stood perfectly still, watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. Neither of them moved for a long moment. Jake realized this was the first time he had ever been this close to an Apache woman, and certainly the first time he had ever helped one. "Are you hurt?" he asked, knowing she probably could not understand him. He gestured toward her arms and body to show what he meant. Ayanna shook her head slightly. She had understood his gesture, if not his words. She studied his face carefully, trying to decide if this white man was a friend or another kind of threat. She had heard many stories about white settlers, and most of them were not good stories. Jake slowly lowered his rifle and held up his hands to show he meant no harm. "My name is Jake," he said, pointing to himself. "Jake Morrison." Ayanna considered this. She had learned some English from traders who occasionally visited her tribe. "Ayanna," she said finally, touching her chest. The sound of her voice surprised Jake. It was deeper than he had expected and musical. "Ayanna," he repeated carefully. She nodded, and for the first time, he saw the hint of a smile on her lips. But the smile faded quickly as they both heard the sound of horses approaching. The three warriors had returned, and they had brought friends. Jake grabbed Ayanna's hand without thinking. "We need to go," he said urgently. "Now." She understood the danger even without understanding his words. Together, they ran toward where Jake had left his horse. Behind them, angry voices were getting closer. Jake knew that his simple act of helping a stranger had just changed his life forever, though he had no idea how much. As they reached his horse, Jake realized they faced a new problem. His horse could carry two people, but not very fast or very far, and they were still many miles from his ranch, with hostile Apache warriors pursuing them through country that offered little shelter. Ayanna looked at Jake with those intense, dark eyes, as if she could read his thoughts. She pointed north toward the mountains and said something in Apache. Then she said, in careful English, "My people." Jake understood. Her tribe was somewhere in those mountains. But between them and safety lay miles of dangerous desert, and somewhere behind them, angry warriors who wanted revenge. Jake helped Ayanna climb onto his horse behind him. She was heavier than most women he had known, but her height and strength were advantages now. She could help him fight if they were caught. As soon as she was settled, Jake spurred his horse forward, heading away from the voices of their pursuers. The horse, a sturdy brown mare named Belle, had carried Jake through many difficult situations over the years. But now she was carrying two people across rough desert terrain, while Apache warriors followed on fresh horses. Jake knew Belle was tough, but he also knew they could not outrun their enemies for very long. As they rode, Ayanna pressed close behind him, her arms around his waist to keep from falling. Jake could feel her tension, but also her strength. This was a woman who knew how to survive in dangerous situations. She occasionally spoke into his ear, giving him directions in her limited English mixed with Apache words. "There," she would say, pointing toward a gap between rocks. "Hide place." Jake trusted her knowledge of the land. She had grown up here while he had only lived in Arizona for 10 years. Together, they guided Belle through narrow passages and around obstacles that might slow down their pursuers. After an hour of hard riding, they stopped at a small waterhole hidden among tall rocks. Belle needed water badly, and both Jake and Ayanna were exhausted from the heat and tension. While the horse drank, Jake climbed up on the rocks to look back the way they had come. He could see dust clouds in the distance. Their enemies were still following, but they had gained some distance. Jake climbed back down to find Ayanna kneeling by the water, cupping it in her hands to drink. She looked up at him with questioning eyes. "How many?" she asked in English. Jake held up his hands, showing 7 fingers. Ayanna's face grew serious. 7 warriors against 1 cowboy and 1 woman. Even a strong woman like herself were not good odds. She stood up and walked to Belle, checking the horse's condition with experienced hands. She ran her fingers along Belle's legs and looked at her hooves. Then she spoke to Jake in a mixture of English and Apache, using gestures to help him understand. What Ayanna was telling him was that Belle could not carry both of them much further in this heat. The horse was already showing signs of exhaustion, and they still had many miles to travel. They needed a new plan. Jake understood the problem. He looked around at the rocky landscape and made a difficult decision. "You take the horse," he said, gesturing for her to mount Belle. "Go to your people, I'll slow them down here." Ayanna stared at him in surprise. She had expected the white man to save himself and leave her behind. That was what the stories about white settlers had taught her to expect. But here was this cowboy offering to sacrifice himself so she could escape. She shook her head firmly. "No," she said in English. Then she pointed to herself and to him, and then toward the mountains. "Together." Jake started to argue, but Ayanna held up her hand to stop him. She pointed to a narrow canyon that led deeper into the rocky hills. Then she pointed to herself and made walking motions with her fingers. She was telling him they should go on foot and hide Belle somewhere safe. It was a risky plan. Without the horse, they would be slower, but they could also hide more easily, and Belle could rest while they found a safe path through the rocks where horses could not follow. Jake made the decision quickly. They led Belle into the narrow canyon until they found a small enclosed area with grass and another water source. It was hidden enough that their pursuers might not find it, and Belle could survive there for several days if necessary. Jake unsaddled Belle and took only what they could carry: his rifle, ammunition, water, and some dried meat. Ayanna took nothing except a small knife she carried on her belt. Together, they continued deeper into the canyon on foot. The walls of the canyon rose high above them, providing shade from the brutal sun. But Jake knew this was also dangerous. If their enemies found them here, there would be few places to run or hide. They moved quickly but quietly, Ayanna leading the way through paths that Jake could barely see. After another hour of walking, they heard the sound they had been dreading. Voices echoing off the canyon walls behind them. The warriors had found their trail. Ayanna grabbed Jake's arm and pulled him toward what looked like a solid rock wall, but as they got closer, Jake saw there was a narrow crack in the rock, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Ayanna pushed him toward it. "In," she whispered urgently. Jake squeezed through the crack and found himself in a small cave hidden behind the rock wall. Ayanna followed him, and they found themselves in complete darkness. They sat perfectly still, listening to the voices of the warriors as they passed by their hiding place. For what felt like hours, they waited in the dark cave. Sometimes the voices seemed very close, sometimes far away. Jake could feel Ayanna's presence next to him, her breathing steady and controlled. Gradually, the voices faded away. When they finally emerged from the cave, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of red and gold. They had lost a full day, but they had also lost their pursuers, at least for now. Ayanna led Jake up a steep path between the rocks. As they climbed higher, the air became cooler and Jake could see further across the desert. In the distance, smoke from several fires rose into the evening sky. "My people," Ayanna said, pointing toward the smoke. But Jake could also see other smoke rising from a different direction, the fires of the warriors who were hunting them. The two groups were closer to each other than Jake liked. As they made camp for the night in a protected spot among the rocks, Jake realized how much his life had changed in just one day. Yesterday, he had been a simple rancher worried about cattle and water rights. Now he was hiding in the mountains with an Apache woman, being hunted by warriors who wanted them both dead. Ayanna shared her knowledge of the desert with him, showing him which plants could be eaten and which ones to avoid. She found water in places where Jake saw only dry rock. She was teaching him how to survive in her world. As they sat by a small fire, carefully hidden so the smoke would not be seen, Ayanna tried to tell Jake about her people. Her English was limited, but with gestures and simple words, she explained that her band of Apache lived peacefully in the mountains. They traded with some white settlers and avoided conflict when possible. The warriors who had been threatening her came from a different group, one that was at war with both the white settlers and other Apache bands. They had wanted to take her as a prisoner to force her people into an alliance with them. Jake listened carefully, beginning to understand that the Apache people were not all the same, just as white people were not all the same. Some were peaceful, some were hostile, and some were just trying to survive in a difficult world. As the stars came out overhead, Jake wondered if he would ever see his ranch again. But looking at Ayana's profile in the firelight, he realized he was not sorry he had helped her. Some things were more important than safety, and protecting someone who needed help was one of those things. Tomorrow, they would continue toward Ayana's people. Jake hoped they would be welcomed there because going back to his ranch now would mean leading their enemies straight to his home. His old life was behind him now, and whatever lay ahead would be determined by the choices he had made this day. The morning sun found Jake and Ayana already walking through the mountain trails. They had started before dawn, wanting to reach her people while they still had the advantage of darkness behind them. The hostile warriors were somewhere in these mountains too, and every hour of delay increased the danger. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the landscape changed from desert scrub to pine trees and flowing streams. Jake had never been this far into Apache territory before. The air was cooler here, and he could see why Ayana's people had chosen this place to live. It was beautiful, and provided everything needed for survival: water, game animals, plants for food and medicine, and natural protection from enemies. Ayana moved through this country like she had been born to it, which of course she had been. She knew every trail, every water source, every place where food could be found. Jake realized how little he really knew about surviving in the wilderness compared to someone like her. Around midday, they stopped to rest and eat some of the dried meat Jake had brought from his saddlebags. Ayana found berries growing wild on some bushes and showed Jake which ones were safe to eat. As they ate, she taught him more English words, and he tried to learn some Apache words from her. "Mountain," Jake said, pointing upward. "Zil," Ayana replied, giving him the Apache word. "Water," Jake said, gesturing toward a nearby stream. "Two," she answered. They were beginning to understand each other better, not just through words, but through shared experience. Jake had never met a woman quite like Ayana. She was strong and independent, able to take care of herself in ways that the women he had known in his previous life could not. But she was also kind and patient, teaching him what he needed to know to survive in her world. Late in the afternoon, they reached a ridge where they could look down into a valley. Below them, Jake saw his first Apache village. It was not what he had expected from the stories he had heard. The village consisted of several wickiups, traditional Apache dwellings made from branches and covered with grass and hides. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and Jake could see people moving about their daily activities. Children were playing games while women worked with food and clothing. Men were tending to horses and making or repairing tools and weapons. It looked peaceful and organized, like any other community where people lived and worked together. Jake had heard so many stories about savage Apache warriors that he had forgotten they were also people who lived normal lives, raising families and trying to provide for their needs. Ayana pointed down at the village and smiled. "Home," she said in English. But as they started down the slope toward the village, Jake noticed something that made his stomach tighten with worry. Several of the men below had spotted them and were reaching for weapons. They had recognized Ayana, but they were not happy to see the white man with her. By the time Jake and Ayana reached the edge of the village, they were surrounded by a dozen Apache warriors. These men looked different from the hostile ones who had been chasing them. Their faces were serious but not filled with hate. They were protecting their people, which Jake could understand and respect. An older man stepped forward from the group. He was tall and dignified, with gray hair and intelligent eyes. His clothing was finer than the others, decorated with intricate beadwork and silver ornaments. Jake realized this must be a chief or other important leader. The old man spoke rapidly to Ayana in Apache. Jake could not understand the words, but he could tell from their tone and body language that the conversation was intense. Ayana was explaining what had happened, gesturing toward Jake and pointing back toward the desert where they had come from. Other people from the village had gathered around them, men, women, and children, all curious about the white stranger who had arrived with Ayana. Some looked suspicious, others merely curious. Jake tried to appear calm and non-threatening, keeping his hands away from his weapons. After several minutes of discussion, the old man turned to look directly at Jake. He studied the cowboy's face carefully, as if trying to read his character and intentions. Finally, he spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "I am Chief Nalnish. Ayana tells me you saved her from Chato's warriors. Why did you do this thing?" Jake was surprised that the chief could speak English, but he answered honestly. "Where? I come from. A man protects women who need help. It doesn't matter what tribe they belong to." Chief Nalnish translated this for the others, and Jake heard murmurs of discussion among the crowd. The chief asked another question. "Ayana says you could have taken your horse and left her to walk. Why did you not do this?" "We were in it together," Jake replied. "If we were going to get away from those warriors, we had to work as a team." Again, the chief translated, and again there was discussion among the Apache people. Jake could see that some seemed impressed by his answers, while others remained suspicious. A middle-aged woman stepped forward and spoke rapidly to the chief. Jake noticed she looked very much like Ayana, the same tall build, the same strong features. This was probably her mother or an aunt. The woman gestured toward Jake and asked what sounded like a question. The chief nodded and turned back to Jake. "Ayana's mother asks if you plan to stay with our people or return to your own kind." This was the question Jake had been dreading. He looked at Ayana, who was watching him with those dark, intelligent eyes. He thought about his ranch, his cattle, his old life. But he also thought about the hostile warriors who were somewhere in these mountains, probably still looking for both of them. "I don't know," Jake answered honestly. "Those warriors who were chasing us might follow me back to my ranch if I go home now. I don't want to bring danger to my neighbors." Chief Nalnish seemed to approve of this answer. He spoke to the crowd in Apache, and Jake heard less grumbling and more interested discussion. "You may stay with us while we decide what to do about Chato's men," the chief said. "But you will give up your weapons while you are here." Jake understood. This was not really a request. He was outnumbered and surrounded, and these people had every reason to be cautious about armed strangers. He slowly removed his gun belt and handed over his rifle. "You will stay in my wickiup tonight," Chief Nalnish continued. "Tomorrow we will talk more about this situation." As the crowd began to disperse, Ayana approached Jake. "Thank you," she said in English, then added something in Apache that he did not understand but that sounded like gratitude. That evening, Jake sat with Chief Nalnish and several other men around a fire outside the chief's dwelling. They shared food, roasted meat, corn, and other dishes that Jake had never tasted before. The Apache men asked him many questions about his life, his ranch, and the white settlements in the territory. Jake tried to answer honestly, explaining that most white settlers were not looking for war with the Apache people. They just wanted to build homes and raise families, much like the Apache themselves. But he also admitted that some white men were hostile and wanted to drive all Apache people away from their traditional lands. As the evening wore on, Jake began to understand the complex situation these people faced. They were caught between hostile Apache bands like Chato's warriors and white settlers who often could not tell the difference between peaceful Apache and hostile ones. They were trying to survive in a world where everyone seemed to be their enemy. "Your government makes treaties with us," Chief Nalnish explained, "but then other white men ignore those treaties. They take our land and kill our people, saying, 'All Apache are the same.'" Jake nodded, understanding the injustice of this situation. "Not all white men think that way," he said. "But I know some do, and I'm sorry for that." The chief studied Jake's face in the firelight. "You are different from most white men we have met. Perhaps there is hope that our peoples can learn to live together in peace." As Jake settled down to sleep that night, he realized his life had taken another dramatic turn. He was now a guest in an Apache village, far from his ranch and his old way of life. But he was beginning to think this might not be such a bad thing. These people had welcomed him despite their natural suspicion of white strangers. They had shown him hospitality and respect. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight Jake felt safer than he had since this whole adventure began. And somewhere in the village, Ayana was sleeping safely among her own people, thanks in part to his willingness to help a stranger in trouble. Jake woke to the sound of people moving about the village and preparing for the day's activities. Through the opening of Chief Nalnish's wiki-up, he could see women tending cooking fires and children playing games. The morning air was cool and fresh, filled with the scent of pine trees and wood smoke. Chief Nalnish was already awake, sitting near the fire and smoking a pipe. He nodded to Jake as the cowboy emerged from his sleeping blankets. "Today, you will learn our ways," the chief said in his careful English. "If you are to stay among us even for a short time, you must understand how we live." Jake nodded, eager to show his willingness to fit in. "I'm ready to learn whatever you want to teach me." The chief smiled slightly. "Good. Ayana will be your teacher. She knows our customs and also speaks your language well enough to explain things to you." As if summoned by their conversation, Ayana appeared at the entrance to the wiki-up. She had changed from her traveling clothes into a beautiful dress made of soft white buckskin decorated with blue and red beads. Her long black hair was braided, with colorful ribbons. Jake thought she looked magnificent. "Come," she said to Jake. "I show you village." For the next several hours, Ayana led Jake around the village, explaining how her people lived and worked. She showed him how the women prepared food, grinding corn into meal and preserving meat for the winter months. She introduced him to the craftsmen who made tools, weapons, and beautiful jewelry from silver and turquoise. Jake was impressed by the skill and artistry he saw everywhere. These people were not the primitive savages he had heard described in stories. They were skilled craftsmen, knowledgeable farmers, and intelligent organizers who had created a functioning community in harmony with the natural world around them. At the village's horse herd, Jake met several of the younger men who cared for the animals. They were curious about his ranch and asked many questions about raising cattle. Jake found himself drawing pictures in the dirt to explain how he managed his herd and maintained his water sources. One young man named Kosin spoke some English and served as a translator when Jake's limited Apache vocabulary failed him. Kosin was fascinated by Jake's descriptions of ranching life. "You live alone on your ranch?" Kosin asked. "Yes," Jake replied. "My wife died several years ago and I never remarried." Kosin translated this for the others, and Jake saw expressions of sympathy on their faces. He realized that among these people, being alone was probably considered a sad thing. Their whole society was built around family groups and community cooperation. As the day continued, Jake found himself helping with various tasks around the village. He assisted the men in repairing a corral fence using skills he had developed on his own ranch. He helped carry water from the stream and gathered firewood from the forest. The Apache people watched him work, and Jake could sense their growing acceptance. He was not just a stranger taking advantage of their hospitality. He was contributing to the community's well-being. That afternoon, Ayana took him to a quiet spot by the stream, where she began teaching him more of the Apache language. She was a patient teacher, repeating words and phrases until he could pronounce them correctly. "Why are you helping me so much?" Jake asked during a break in their lesson. Ayana was quiet for a moment, thinking about how to answer in English. "You help me when you not have to," she finally said. "Now I help you." "Is that the only reason?" Jake pressed gently. She looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes. "No," she said softly. "Not only reason." Before Jake could ask what she meant, they were interrupted by a commotion from the direction of the village. Shouts and the sound of running feet carried across the valley. Jake and Ayana hurried back toward the wiki-ups to see what was happening. They arrived to find the entire village in an uproar. Chief Nalnish was standing in the center of the camp, talking rapidly, with several men who had obviously just arrived from somewhere else. These men were covered with dust and looked exhausted, as if they had been riding hard. Ayana spoke quickly to one of the women, then turned to Jake with concern on her face. "Scouts," she explained. "They say Chado's warriors are coming this way. Maybe one day, maybe 2 days." Jake felt his stomach tighten. The hostile warriors had not given up their pursuit. Worse, they were bringing the fight to Ayana's peaceful people. Chief Nalnish called for everyone to gather around him. He spoke in Apache for several minutes, his voice grave and serious. Jake could not understand the words, but the meaning was clear from the reactions of the people around him. They were in danger. When the chief finished speaking, Ayana translated for Jake. He says we must prepare to fight or prepare to run. Chato has maybe 20 warriors now. Our village has only 12 men who can fight. What about the women? Jake asked. I've seen that Ayana can fight. She translated his question, and several people smiled grimly. Our women fight too, Ayana said, but still not enough against 20 warriors. Chief Nalnish approached Jake and Ayana. This is your fault and my responsibility, he said to Jake, but his tone was not accusing. Chato's men follow you here, but we chose to help you. Now we must decide together what to do. Jake felt terrible guilt. His decision to help Ayana had brought danger to her entire people. Give me back my weapons, he said. I'll leave the village and lead them away from here. No, Ayana said immediately. They kill you alone. Then they come back here anyway. Chief Nalnish nodded in agreement. She is right. Chato wants war with us. He uses this as excuse, but he would find another excuse soon enough. The chief called together the village council, the older men and women who helped make important decisions. Jake was surprised when he was invited to join the discussion. For the next hour, they debated various options. They could try to negotiate with Chato, but everyone agreed this was unlikely to succeed. The hostile chief wanted to force all Apache bands to join his war against the white settlers, and Chief Nalnish's peaceful people would never agree to this. They could flee deeper into the mountains, but this would mean abandoning their homes and most of their possessions. With winter coming soon, starting over in a new location would be extremely difficult. Finally, they could stand and fight, using the natural defenses of their mountain village to hold off the larger force of attackers. This was dangerous, but it would allow them to protect their homes and way of life. As the discussion continued, Jake had an idea. What if we don't have to choose between fighting and running? He suggested. Chief Nalnish looked interested. Explain. My ranch has strong buildings and good defensive positions, Jake said. If your people came there, we could defend it together. And I have neighbors, other ranchers who would help us fight Chato's warriors. There was silence as everyone considered this suggestion. Jake realized he was proposing something that had probably never happened before. Apache people and white settlers working together to defend against a common enemy. Your people would accept us? Chief Nalnish asked skeptically. Jake thought about his neighbors, men like Bill Harrison and Tom Murphy, who had helped him through difficult times on his ranch. They were good people, but they had also lived through Apache raids in the past. Some would, Jake said honestly. Others might take convincing. But if I explained the situation, that you're peaceful people being attacked by the same warriors who threaten us, I think most would help. Ayana translated for those who did not speak English, and Jake could see the idea spreading through the group. It was radical and risky, but it might be their best chance of survival. Chief Nalnish stood up slowly. We will consider this plan, he announced. Tonight we prepare for whatever we decide. Tomorrow we choose our path. As the council dispersed, Ayana walked with Jake toward the edge of the village. You would really bring my people to your ranch? She asked. Yes, Jake replied without hesitation. If it means keeping everyone safe, yes. She looked at him with something that might have been admiration. You are very different, white man, Jake Morrison. Maybe, Jake said. Or maybe I'm just learning that we're not so different after all. Dawn came too quickly for the people of Chief Nalnish's village. During the night, the council had made their decision. They would accept Jake's offer and travel to his ranch. It was their best chance of survival against Chato's superior force. But moving an entire village was no simple task. There were elderly people who could not travel quickly, children who needed constant care, and precious possessions that the people could not bear to leave behind. Jake watched in amazement as the Apache families efficiently organized their most important belongings and prepared for the difficult journey ahead. Ayana worked alongside her mother and aunts, carefully packing food, medicine, and sacred items that could not be replaced. Jake helped the men gather the horse herd and prepare weapons for the journey. Everyone knew that Chato's warriors might attack them along the trail. "How long to your ranch?" Chief Nalnish asked Jake as they loaded the last of the supplies. 2 days if we move fast," Jake replied. 3 days with the children and elderly people." The chief nodded grimly. "Our scouts say Chato is 1 day behind us. We must move very fast." By mid-morning, the entire village was on the move. Jake rode at the front with Chief Nalnish and several other men, serving as guides toward his ranch. Behind them came the women, children, and elderly people, surrounded by the remaining warriors for protection. Ayana rode near the middle of the group, helping to keep everyone organized and moving. She had tied her long hair back and wore practical traveling clothes, but she still carried herself with the dignity and strength that Jake had first noticed when he saw her confronting Chato's warriors. The trail down from the mountains was treacherous, winding through narrow passes and rocky slopes that could easily cause accidents for horses carrying heavy loads. Several times they had to stop and help families negotiate particularly difficult sections of the path. Jake found himself constantly looking back over his shoulder, watching for signs of pursuit. The dust cloud their group was creating could be seen for miles, making it impossible to hide their movement. He knew that Chato's warriors would have no trouble following their trail. By afternoon, they had reached the flatter desert country below the mountains. Here they could move faster, but they were also more exposed. Jake pushed the pace as much as he dared, knowing that every mile they covered brought them closer to safety but also closer to exhaustion for the weakest members of their group. An old woman named Itza began to struggle with the heat and difficult pace. She was Ayana's grandmother, a respected elder who had lived through many hardships in her long life. When she started to fall behind, Ayana immediately rode back to help her. "Grandmother cannot keep up," Ayana told Jake when he came back to check on them. "She needs rest." Jake looked at the old woman who was clearly suffering but trying hard not to show it. He also looked back toward the mountains, where he could now see dust clouds that probably meant Chato's warriors were getting closer. "We can't stop," Jake said reluctantly. "If we do, they'll catch us." "Then I stay with grandmother," Ayana replied firmly. Jake realized this was not just about one old woman. This was about the Apache people's commitment to caring for their elders, even at great personal risk. He made a quick decision. "Put her on my horse," he said, dismounting. "I'll walk for a while." Ayana looked at him with surprise and gratitude. Together, they helped Itza onto Jake's horse, where she could ride more comfortably. Jake began walking, alongside the horse, keeping pace with the group despite the rocky ground that was hard on his boots. Other members of the group noticed Jake's sacrifice, and word spread quickly through the traveling families. Several young Apache men offered to take turns walking so Jake could ride, but he declined. He wanted to show these people that he was truly committed to their welfare. As the sun began to set, they finally had to stop for the night. They were still half a day's travel from Jake's ranch, but people and horses were exhausted and could go no further. Jake hoped they had gained enough distance from their pursuers to risk a few hours of rest. They made a cold camp with no fires that might give away their position. People shared food and water quietly, and parents tried to keep their children calm and quiet. Everyone understood that their lives depended on not being discovered by Chato's warriors. Jake found himself sitting next to Ayana and her grandmother as they shared some dried meat and water. The old woman, Itza, spoke to him in Apache and Ayana translated. She says thank you for helping her today. She says you have a good heart for a white man. Jake smiled at the elderly woman. Tell her it was an honor to help her. When Ayana translated his words, Itza nodded approvingly and patted Jake's arm with her weathered hand. Then she spoke again, longer this time, gesturing toward Ayana. What did she say? Jake asked. Ayana's cheeks colored slightly in the moonlight. She says you would make good husband for Apache woman. She says I should consider this. Now, it was Jake's turn to feel embarrassed. But he also felt something else. A warm feeling that he had not experienced since his wife Mary died years ago. What do you think? He asked quietly. Ayana was quiet for a long moment. I think maybe grandmother is wise woman. Before Jake could respond, one of the scouts came running into their camp. He spoke urgently to Chief Nalnish in Apache, and Jake could see the worry on everyone's faces even without understanding the words. Ayana quickly translated. Chato's men are closer than we thought, maybe only few hours behind us. And there are more of them now, maybe 30 warriors. Chief Nalnish gathered the group leaders around him. We cannot outrun them tomorrow, he said in English for Jake's benefit. Too many old people and children. They will catch us before we reach the ranch. Then we make our stand here, said Kosin, the young man who had befriended Jake. No, Jake said firmly. The ranch has better defenses, stone buildings, water-prepared positions. We need to get there. But how? Asked Chief Nalnish. We cannot move fast enough. Jake thought quickly, considering their options. Finally, he had an idea that might work, though it would be dangerous. Some of us create a diversion, he said. Draw Chato's warriors away from the main group. The fastest riders go with me and make them think we're all heading in a different direction. The rest of you continue to the ranch. Chief Nalnish shook his head. Too dangerous. They will kill anyone they catch. Maybe, Jake admitted. But if we all stay together, they'll kill everyone. This way, most people have a chance to reach safety. The discussion continued for several minutes with various people suggesting modifications to the plan. Finally, they agreed on a strategy. Jake would lead a small group of the best riders southeast, leaving an obvious trail for Chato to follow. The main group would continue toward Jake's ranch, moving as quickly as possible. Ayana immediately volunteered to go with Jake's diversion group. You will need someone who knows the country, she argued, when Jake tried to convince her to stay with the main group. It's too dangerous, Jake protested. More dangerous for you without someone who knows where to find water and shelter, she replied practically. Chief Nalnish settled the argument. She goes. But you bring her back safely, Jake Morrison. As the group prepared to split up, Jake felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. He was leading these people away from their homes toward an uncertain future, and now he was risking the life of the woman who had become so important to him. But as he looked at the faces around him, men, women, and children who trusted him to help them find safety, Jake knew he had made the right choice. Sometimes a man had to risk everything to protect the people he cared about. Tomorrow would bring the greatest challenge of his life, but tonight he was surrounded by people who had accepted him as one of their own. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The sun was barely showing above the horizon when Jake's diversion group rode away from the main camp. Besides Jake and Ayana, the group included Kosin and 4 other young Apache warriors who volunteered for the dangerous mission. Their job was to create a trail so obvious that Chato's warriors could not miss it, leading them away from the families heading toward Jake's ranch. They rode hard toward the southeast, deliberately breaking branches, disturbing rocks, and leaving clear hoofprints in the soft ground near water holes. Jake hoped this false trail would buy the main group enough time to reach his ranch safely. After 2 hours of hard riding, they stopped at a small hill where they could look back across the desert. In the distance, they could see the dust cloud. That meant Chato's warriors were following their trail. The plan was working. How far to your ranch from here? Kosin asked Jake. Maybe 10 miles, Jake replied, pointing toward the northwest. If we can keep Chato busy for a few more hours, our people should make it there safely. Ayana was studying the landscape ahead of them. There, she said, pointing to a cluster of large rocks about a mile away. Good place to make stand. They have to come at us from front. No way to surround us. Jake looked at the position she had chosen and nodded approvingly. It was exactly the kind of defensive position he would have selected. High ground, good cover, and limited approaches for enemies. They reached the rocks just as Chato's warriors came into view behind them. Jake counted at least 25 men, all mounted and heavily armed. The odds were not good, but their position gave them some advantage. Remember, Jake told the group, we don't have to defeat them. We just have to hold them here long enough for our people to reach safety. The Apache warriors nodded grimly. They had all accepted that this might be their last fight, but they were determined to make it count. Chato's warriors spread out as they approached, trying to find ways to attack. They defended position from multiple directions, but Ayana had chosen well. The rocks formed a natural fortress that could only be approached from the front. The first attack came within minutes. Half a dozen warriors charged up the slope toward their position, firing rifles and shooting arrows. Jake and his companions returned fire from behind the protective rocks, and their accurate shooting forced the attackers to retreat. But Jake knew this was only the beginning. Shadow was testing their defenses, learning about their weapons and numbers. The real attack would come soon. During the brief pause between attacks, Ayana moved closer to Jake. "If we do not survive this," she said quietly, "I want you to know something." "We'll survive," Jake said firmly. "Maybe," she replied. "But if not, I want you to know that helping me was best thing that happened to me in long time. You show me that white man and Apache can trust each other." Jake looked into her dark eyes and felt his heart racing. "Ayana, His words were cut off by shouts from Kosin. "They come again!" This time, Chadow's entire force was attacking. Warriors approached from 3 directions using the scattered rocks and bushes for cover. The firing was intense, and Jake could hear bullets whistling past his head and striking the rocks around him. One of their group, a young warrior named Naiche, cried out and fell backward with a bullet wound in his shoulder. Ayana immediately crawled over to help him while Jake and the others continued firing at the attackers. The battle lasted for what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the smoke cleared, Chadow's warriors had again been forced to retreat, but not without cost. Naiche was seriously wounded, and their ammunition was running dangerously low. Jake knew they could not hold out much longer. But as he prepared for what might be their final stand, he heard something that made his heart leap with hope: the sound of horses approaching from the northwest. At first, he feared it might be more of Chadow's warriors coming to surround them. But as the riders came closer, Jake recognized the lead horseman. It was Bill Harrison, his nearest neighbor, leading a group of ranchers and cowboys. Behind Harrison came more riders. Other neighbors Jake recognized, and some he did not. But most surprising of all, mixed in with the white cowboys were Apache, warriors from Chief Nalnish's band. Somehow the 2 groups had joined together to come to Jake's rescue. The arrival of reinforcements changed everything. Chadow's warriors, who had been preparing for another attack on Jake's small group, suddenly found themselves outnumbered and caught between 2 forces. What followed was less a battle than a rout. Faced with overwhelming odds, most of Chadow's warriors scattered and fled toward the mountains. A few tried to make a stand, but they were quickly overwhelmed. Shadow himself was captured trying to escape on foot after his horse was shot. He stood defiant and proud even in defeat, refusing to show fear or ask for mercy. As the dust settled, Bill Harrison rode up to Jake's position. "You all right, Jake?" he called out. "We're fine, Bill," Jake replied, hardly believing what had just happened. "But how did you find us, and how did you end up working with the Apache?" Harrison grinned. "Well, that's quite a story. Chief Nalnish and his people showed up at your ranch about 2 hours ago. At first, some of the boys wanted to start shooting, but the chief had your letter." "My letter?" "The one you wrote explaining the situation," Harrison said. "One of the Apache boys who speaks English delivered it to me this morning. Once we understood what was happening, that these were peaceful Apache being attacked by the same hostiles who have been raiding our ranches, well, it seemed like we ought to help." Jake looked around at the mixed group of cowboys and Apache warriors who had come to their rescue. White men and Apache were talking together, sharing water, and helping tend to the wounded from both sides. It was something he had never thought he would see. Chief Nalnish rode up to where Jake and Ayana were standing. "My people are safe at your ranch," he reported. "Your neighbors have welcomed them and helped them settle in." "What happens now?" Jake asked. The chief dismounted and looked around at the scene. Chadow's defeated warriors, the mixed group of rescuers, and the evidence of successful cooperation between 2 peoples who had been enemies. "Now," he said slowly, "I think we learn to be neighbors instead of enemies." Over the following weeks, Jake's ranch became the center of a remarkable experiment in cooperation. Chief Nalnish's people established a semi-permanent camp on Jake's land, helping with ranch work in exchange for protection and supplies. Some of the Apache men proved to be excellent cowboys, and some of Jake's neighbors began to appreciate their skills and knowledge. Not everyone was happy with the arrangement. Some white settlers remained suspicious of the Apache, and some Apache from other bands criticized Chief Nalnish for cooperating with white men. But the success of their partnership in defeating Chato's warriors had proven that cooperation was possible. As autumn turned to winter, Jake found his feelings for Ayanna growing stronger. She had proven herself not just as a strong and capable woman, but as someone who shared his vision of a future where different peoples could live together in peace. One evening, as they sat watching the sunset from the porch of his ranch house, Jake finally found the courage to speak his heart. "Ayanna," he said, "your grandmother said I might make a good husband for an Apache woman. What do you think?" She looked at him with those dark, intelligent eyes that had captivated him from their first meeting. "I think," she said slowly, "that Jake Morrison might make good husband for this Apache woman." When they married the following spring, it was a ceremony that combined both Apache and white traditions. Chief Nalnish performed the Apache rituals while the local preacher added the Christian elements. Cowboys and Apache warriors celebrated together, and Jake's neighbors brought wedding gifts alongside Ayanna's relatives. Their marriage became a symbol of what was possible when people chose cooperation over conflict, understanding over prejudice. Jake's ranch became known throughout the territory as a place where Apache and white families worked together, proving that two very different peoples could find common ground. Years later, when visitors asked Jake how it had all started, he would tell them about the day he saw a tall Apache woman standing up to 3 warriors who meant her harm. He would explain that sometimes the most important moment in a man's life comes when he chooses to help a stranger in trouble, not knowing where that choice will lead him. And Ayanna would add that sometimes the greatest adventures begin when someone is willing to stand between danger and someone who needs protection, showing that courage and kindness can bridge any divide between peoples who are willing to try.